Good morning. Well, the past few months have been a little crazy and stressful for the Ellis household. So a couple months ago, we've been thinking about this for a long time, but finally made a decision that we were going to sell our house and we were going to downsize to something smaller now that 2 out of our 4 boys are kind of out of the house and on their own. So we've been kind of preparing to sell our house and looking for another house. And the good news is we did sell our house very quickly. And then we've also found another house, and so we have contracts on both houses still waiting for them to close. And in the meantime, we're packing. Our house looks like a war zone. We're selling furniture right out from underneath our kids. They came in yesterday, and Coleman was like, "What happened to our couches?" And I was like, "They're gone, dude. Sorry." So it looks, we got boxes. It just kind of looks like a little bit of a war zone. And we're just, all this is kind of up in the air. Just feels very much like we're in flux. And during all this craziness, I realized that I'd become very irritable, anxious, and impatient, right? I mean, somehow in the process, I just kind of lost my joy, right? Now, the good news is, I found my joy this past week, and here's how it happened. I'd been praying about a couple of really big issues in my life that had nothing to do with houses or contracts or any of the logistical stuff that we were dealing with. And God, on Monday, both 2 huge prayers that I'd been praying, God answered in just a very clear way. Right, and so I kind of came back to my office after lunch, and I was just thinking about that, and I began to kind of pray and thank God for that. And as I began thanking Him for the way that He answered those 2 really big, important prayers that I'd been praying, I just kind of zoomed out a little bit, and I just began thinking about a lifetime of God's kindness, of all the ways and all the times that He's come through for me and showed Himself very strong on behalf of me or my family, or just the kindness that He's shown Jenny and I all these years, and just how faithful He's been. And then it was just kind of like it just kind of began to swell. And then I started just thinking about, regardless of all the stuff He's done for me, I was just thinking what a miracle it is that I was saved. What a miracle it is that God rescued me, that my sins are forgiven, that I'm His son. And I just started thinking about salvation. And so it was just kind of one of those moments where it started out just as a prayer of gratitude for 2 specific answered prayers, but it just kind of swelled on me. And slowly, in my office, my anxiety just kind of dissipated, and my impatience went away, and it was just kind of eclipsed by just a sense of joy again. And it was at that moment that I realized that I had lost my joy. And it wasn't until that moment that I realized how important joy was. And then I had this thought: wouldn't it be great if I could somehow live with that kind of joy all the time? Right? I mean, you think about that. Have any of you ever lost your joy? Right? Wouldn't it be great if you had more joy in your life? And I think the answer is we all want more joy. But it's very difficult to maintain joy. And it's interesting, the Bible actually makes a distinction between happiness and joy, right? That those are not synonymous. Happiness tends to be kind of temporal or temporary and circumstantial, right? We're happy when good things happen. We're happy when life's kind of playing out the way that we had hoped or planned. But happiness by nature is fleeting and it's conditional, right? As soon as something bad happens, happiness vanishes. So happiness is a good thing, but there is something more desirable and more... All right, that's awesome. Okay, we're back. And that what is more permanent and more desirable than happiness is joy. And joy was a big deal for Jesus. I mean, it just seemed like He was living off of this constant supply of joy, which kind of makes sense in some ways, right? But what's interesting is what Jesus didn't seem to think that His joy was something that was only possible for Him. In fact, He promised that kind of joy to His followers. And it was ironically, He talked, if you look and kind of look at the 4 Gospels, the 4 accounts of Jesus' life and His death and His resurrection, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. If you look at those, here's a really cool irony that occurred to me this week as I was studying for this. Jesus talks the most about joy at a time when his inner circle of disciples was about to experience the most unsettling, disorienting, faith-testing trial of their life. They were about to see their beloved leader falsely accused, arrested, publicly humiliated, and then ultimately crucified on a cross. And as if that weren't enough, they were also themselves about to become targets of opposition and persecution. So the question is, how does Jesus prepare his disciples to face the trials that lay just ahead of them? And the answer is this: he promised them joy. So we've been in this series of messages called Until the End, and we've been kind of eavesdropping in John's Gospel, chapters 13 to 17. It's called the Upper Room Discourse or Conversation. And it's the most detailed account that we have of the conversations that Jesus had with his disciples on the night that he ultimately was arrested and betrayed and turned over, the night before he would be crucified the next day. Last week, Zach looked at John 15 at the beginning of that chapter, and at this point in the conversation, Jesus began talking about this metaphor. And he talked about himself as the vine, and we're the branches. And he basically was talking about this intimate relationship that he wanted to have with us. And he basically said that if we stay intimately connected to him, and he used words like abide or remain, if you abide in me and remain in me, and he says that our life is going to bear the fruits of obedience and joy and sacrificial love for each other. And that section ends in chapter 15, verse 17, when Jesus says, "This is my command. I want you to love each other. I want you to love each other." And then there's this abrupt shift that happens. So he goes from, I want you to love each other. And he's talking about this intimate connection. And then this is verse 18. He says, "If the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first." It shifts just that quickly from, I want you to love each other. And then he says, if the world hates you, please keep this in mind. The world hated me first. And with those words, Jesus begins to warn them about the inevitability of this hostility and this opposition that they are going to experience because of their intimate friendship with Jesus. Verse 19 of chapter 15 says, "If the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first." Verse 20, "If they persecuted me, they'll also persecute you." Chapter 16, verse 2, and this is just really ramping it up. He says, "A time is coming when anyone who kills you will think he's offering a service to God." I mean, you talk about just trying to imagine and put yourself in the room with those disciples. And this conversation, it just seems like this emotional roller coaster ride for the disciples. You see, they don't know what Jesus knows, right? And so it's only going to be later that they're going to look back and somehow this is all going to make sense. But in real time, his words had to be disorienting and very troubling. They could barely fathom that Jesus was going to suffer and die, but now he's warning that they too are going to face hostility and persecution from those who oppose Jesus. And to make matters worse, he's leaving. Later on in chapter 16, he says this, "In a little while you'll see me no more, and then after a little while you'll see me." So Jesus had already kind of alluded to the fact that he was going away. That was at the beginning of chapter 14. But now he mentions it again, and the disciples want desperately to know what he means. And so in verses 20 to 24 of chapter 16, Jesus tells them exactly what he means. Verse 20, he says, "I tell you the truth, you will weep and mourn while the world rejoices. You will grieve, but your grief will turn to joy." So basically, Jesus is telling them that the religious leaders and the Romans are going to conspire to kill Jesus. And when Jesus is finally dead, they will rejoice. In other words, they will think in some way that they have won, that they have triumphed, that they have extinguished Jesus. And the disciples are going to experience grief and sadness as they watch Jesus humiliated, tortured, and killed. And this is the one that they love. This is the Jesus they've been with for 3 years, and they've seen so many profound things, and he's touched their lives. in such a meaningful way. And when they see him tortured and killed, they're going to be filled with grief and sadness. But their grief will not be the end of the story, because Jesus says their grief will then turn to joy. The question is, why? How is their grief and their sadness going to be changed or turned into joy? And he gives the answer in verse 22 when he says, "So with you, now is your time of grief, but I will see you again, and you will rejoice, and no one will take away your joy." So after the crucifixion, the disciples are going to be grief-stricken. They're going to be sad. And they're going to be disillusioned until Easter morning, right? When they see Jesus raised from the dead, they will have a joy, Jesus says, that no one can ever take away from you. When they see the resurrected Jesus, they'll know that everything that he said was true, right? That every promise that he made is going to be fulfilled. They'll know that God's love and his salvation are theirs, right? They also know that the mission that Jesus started would continue. So if Jesus is indestructible, then so is their joy, because now they'll have him forever. And more importantly, he has them forever, right? And that joy is available to all of Jesus' followers. That joy is ours. That joy has been promised not only to the original disciples, but that joy is ours, right? Because Jesus is alive. And so the question, I think, that just kind of the street level practicality of this is, here's the question, I think, for us this morning. How is your joy level these days? You could kind of quantify your joy in some way, right? On a scale of 1 to 10, 1 is your Eeyore, like you live in the Eeyore reality most of the time, and 10 would be your Tigger, right? You're just jumping off the charts, right? Where are you at on that chart? 1 is 1, then a 10 is Tigger. Where would you say that you're doing something? What's going on with that? Hello, test. Oh, we're back. Okay, sorry. I'm probably hitting something. Okay. I'm just going to keep my hands right here. Okay. So where would you be right now? And the question becomes then, most of us are not where we wished we would be. We'd love to all be kind of level 10 joy, the fullness of joy that Jesus talked about. But most of the time, that isn't the case. We probably fluctuate all over the place, right? So one of the questions, the next question could be, what is it that tends to steal your joy? And there's probably a lot of different answers to that. Possible joy stealers might include financial stress, right? Some of you are there right now. Right? It's tough for you to tap into that sense of joy because you're just struggling financially. There's just so much pressure. You're not sure how you're going to make ends meet. Or maybe you're in a job search and it's just taking longer than you thought. And you see your reserves getting smaller and smaller. And you're beginning to imagine and play out the scenarios that are going to happen as the dominoes begin to fall financially. That can be a joy stealer. Maybe it's relationship challenges. Right? Maybe you're just conflict. Maybe it's something with your parents. Maybe it's in your marriage, maybe. It just seems like nothing ever changes. There's always struggle or strife, or just kind of, you're just not on the same playing field. You're not going in the same direction. It could be just family conflict that's just historic. It just never gets better. It could just be loneliness. I think loneliness is a huge joy stealer, right? That you just find yourself alone sometimes. Sometimes it's a lack of contentment that can steal your joy, right? You just begin to think about all the things you don't have yet, or the things you haven't accomplished yet, or life just doesn't seem like it's where it needs to be yet. And so you find yourself saying things like, I sure am going to be happy when, fill in the blank. Or I'll be full of joy as soon as, fill in the blank. Right? It's a lack of contentment. Or maybe it's just disappointment. Things haven't played out like you hoped. And sometimes it's just straight up suffering. Right? Some of you you're facing either physical suffering or some kind of chronic pain, or maybe it's a diagnosis, some kind of terminal diagnosis. And as you just think about the physical suffering or the emotional suffering you're in, it just becomes difficult to maintain any kind of joy. And here's the thing. Every one of those things I just said is inevitable in life. The goal is not to try and arrange for a trouble-free life. It's impossible. In fact, at the end of this chapter in verse 33, Jesus says, in this world you will have trouble. So if anybody tries to tell you, man, if you just would follow Jesus, if you just would entrust your life to God, life's going to go so much better and smoother for you, they're lying. That's not altogether true. Now, is life, in a sense, ultimately always better with God? Of course it is. But Jesus says following him does not insulate you from trouble or hardship or trial. He goes on to say, but take heart because I have overcome the world. So for Jesus, he wants his followers to have joy despite the reality of trouble or disappointment in their life. And he's offering them something that no one and nothing else in this world can offer. Did you think about this? I mean, the world wants to look everywhere else other than God to find some kind of contentment or satisfaction or joy or happiness. And the problem is that everyone and everything in creation is temporal. It's all fleeting, right? And it cannot possibly connect us to ultimate joy. In fact, in big or small ways, everyone and everything will eventually fall short, fail us, wear out, be replaced with some better option. So if we attach our joy to temporal things, we're always going to be disappointed. But right here, Jesus is declaring that if we'll stay connected with him, we will have a source of joy that will run deeper than the inevitable disappointments of life. I mean, notice what he says in verse 21. He has this metaphor that he uses. He says, a woman giving birth to a child has pain because her time has come. But when her baby is born, she forgets her anguish because of her joy that a child is born into the world. Now, here's what I love about Jesus' realism, right? As he talks about joy, as he talks about tapping into something that's of kind of an eternal quality, now he doesn't get kind of pie in the sky, superficial, mystical, kind of fuzzy woo-woo like Hallmark, right? He's very real. He's very practical. And so it's interesting, he goes right to a metaphor that's universally associated with both joy and pain, right? I mean, I've been with Jenny for the birth of our 3 biological sons. And if you've been present in the final days or hours of a woman's labor, you know that the pain is no joke, right? You also know, if you're a man, to never say you know what she's going through. Just lessons learned. I got a bunch more of those I could give you. You also, just on a complete side note, unrelated, if you are a guy and you experience a kidney stone, you should also never say that I think I know what you went through now. That doesn't seem to go over well at all. Even though I think that that's true. Jenny's not here today, so I can say that. But Jesus does not say, here's for an example. So what I love about Jesus' realism is this. He doesn't say, listen, there was a very godly pregnant woman who was so full of the joy that I've promised you that she went through the pregnancy and the labor without any pain. She just had a smile on her face. She's quoting scripture verses the whole time. She busted out into a worship chorus at one point at the pinnacle of her labor. And that's the kind of joy that I want to offer you. That's what's available. It's not what Jesus says. He says she feels the pain and she experiences the anguish. And when the baby is born, the temporal pain fades into the background and joy takes center stage. So for Jesus, even in this example, he's saying pain and joy coexist in the life of those who follow Jesus. Following Jesus is not a call to try to pretend we don't feel pain. Joy does not replace pain or do away with the pain. They coexist. So it's not that we don't feel hurt and disappointment in life or that we don't express it. It's just that we're not destroyed by it. It ultimately doesn't control us. Sometimes I think we try to deny the pain of life, or we try to pretend it's not that bad because we think that strong Christians are not supposed to always be happy, and that to be sad or to be disappointed is somehow the opposite of joy. So we learn to pretend, and we kind of suck it up, and we quote Bible verses, and we have Christian bumper stickers, and it's all in some kind of hope that we can rise above and avoid the pain. But Jesus doesn't call us to fake it, right? I mean, Jesus was the most emotionally healthy and whole person who ever walked on planet Earth. And yet there were times when Jesus wept. There were times he was overcome with sadness. I think of when he comes to Lazarus' tomb, and Lazarus had died, and there's Mary and Martha, his sisters, and they're both very upset, right? And then if you ever want to memorize a verse in the Bible, you can memorize the shortest one where it says Jesus wept. Because what's fascinating to me about that is he knew he was about to raise Lazarus from the dead. But he doesn't say, hey, Mary, listen, I get that you're sad, whatever, but you don't realize I'm about to do my thing. I'm about to raise him from the dead, so just cheer up, chill out. You don't need to be sad. He's so emotionally healthy and available that even in the moment before he's about to make it all different and raise him from the dead, he weeps with Mary. Final week of Jesus' life, as he approaches Jerusalem and he's up on the mountain looking down into Jerusalem, the capital city of David, the imperial city of God's people. He looks down, it says he's just overcome with sadness, and he weeps over the city for how lost they are. In the Garden of Gethsemane, later on, after this what we're looking at in John 15 and 16, he'll end up in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he will weep as he wrestles it out with his Father, as he anticipates the suffering that lies ahead. So Jesus is emotionally healthy and whole, and there's this undercurrent of joy that sustains him, but he still is able to acknowledge pain and sadness and trial. So we can cry, and we can pray, and we can reach out to others, and we can be honest about our pain because of that deeper joy. Right? In some ways, I think it's because we have this promise of a deeper joy that we actually can enter sadness or discouragement, or we can acknowledge pain and express it, because we don't have to fear that we'll be lost in it. We don't have to fear that if I finally acknowledge how sad I am or broken I am about my marriage, or about that terminal diagnosis, or about that concern that I have for my kids, that I won't snap out of it, I'll never come back. See, we don't have to fear that, because we're people in whom joy and pain can coexist, because joy always triumphs. Joy always runs deeper. And I like to think of joy as kind of an undertow, right? I mean, most of us have been to the beach, and so we live around the beach, and we all kind of know what it is to think about what an undertow or a rip current is. It means that despite what you see, and that when you go to the beach and you look out, it could be completely calm, or it could be choppy and huge waves are crashing everywhere. But what that rip current, that undertow means is that despite what you see on the surface, or how well you think you understand the movement of the waves, that there's this invisible current of water below the surface, and it is steadily and rapidly moving in one direction. Right? And it is powerfully and relentlessly moving everything and anyone or anything that is trapped in its flow. And it's dangerous. And what's particularly dangerous about it is that there's days when it just seems calm and tranquil. And so you drop your guard and you think, I can handle this. I can swim out, or I can surf, or I can do whatever it is I'm going to do, and I'll be fine. That's why it's dangerous. It's unseen, it's hidden, but it's there and it's powerful. When I was 10 years old, my father was stationed at Pearl Harbor. He was in the Navy. And so me and my two brothers had the chance to go live in Hawaii for about a year while my dad was stationed there. And so my oldest brother, at that time I was 10, my oldest brother was 16, his name's Jimmy. And we used to go to, there was different beaches around. We lived on Oahu, and so there were some beaches that were just a little bit more like the east coast of Florida, 3 to 5 foot waves, pretty low level waves. But then there was places you could go where it'd be like 15 and 20 foot waves. And one of those beaches was called Makaha Beach, and it was kind of near the North Shore. And so this one day, my oldest brother, who had began to boogie board, asked my dad if we could go there, right? So I'm kind of freaking out because those waves are humongous. And we just decided we'd goof around on the beach and play kind of inshore. My brother, who thought he was, becoming a professional boogie boarder of some kind, decided he was going to go out on these waves. Well, it was kind of a flat day, so really the waves weren't that big. And so my dad was kind of coaching him, we'll do this, and he's like, Dad, chill out, the waves are not that big, I'll be fine, right? Well, we're there for about 30 minutes, and we look out, and Jimmy's nowhere. Like, we can't see him. My dad, all I remember is thinking, I see my dad panicking, right, like any father would panic. Because he was out there weren't many people on the beach that day. Well, he's gone. He's not anywhere on the beach. We're looking up and down the beach. We're all panicking, kind of freaking out, whatever. Well, about 30 minutes goes by. At this point, the Coast Guard's been notified. The lifeguards are all kind of doing their thing, walkie-talkies, and they're starting to send out. And then all of a sudden, my brother comes walking up. A boat picked him up a mile out in the ocean. A mile. Dude was a mile out in the ocean because he got caught in that undertow. And he tried to swim against it, and all the stuff they tell you not to do, he did. And it was just that quick. That's how fast it was moving, and that's how far out it took him. Right? Imperceptible. He couldn't have seen it. We couldn't have known about it. We weren't even thinking about it. And yet it was there. Right? And that, to me, that's ultimately what Jesus promises his followers, is this kind of undertow of joy that flows regardless of whether the waters of your everyday life are calm and positive and happy and most things are working out. There's that undertow of joy. But also when life is stormy and crazy and the waves are huge and the challenges are real and they're in your face and you feel like you're drowning and you feel like you can't face another day, and there's also that undertow of joy that's there to sustain us. And Jesus, here's the interesting thing. Jesus isn't just using the metaphor of the woman in labor as a metaphor for what the disciples are going to experience. He is, but I don't think that's all he's using it for. I think he knows it's also a picture about what he's about to go through. So he's about to enter a season of pain. His hour of pain has come. And so he's about to suffer. He's about to be humiliated. He's about ultimately to be crucified on a cross, and it was freely chosen. And so what is it that enabled him to choose this path? And it's the same answer, joy. I love in Hebrews chapter 12, it says this in verse 2, for the joy that was set before him, talking about Jesus, he endured the cross, despising the shame. So it was joy that enabled Jesus to endure the cross. In other words, there was a joy that was on the other side of all the suffering he was about to go through. And it was his anticipation of that joy that was on the other side of it that enabled him to go through it. The question becomes, what is it? What was that joy that was on the other side of the suffering? And the answer is us. That was the answer. That was the joy that lay on the other side of Jesus' suffering, is that he knew he would experience the joy of knowing that we could be rescued, that we now could be forgiven, that we could be welcomed home. And that's what enabled Jesus to walk through the pain of suffering and death. He made us his treasure. He made us the object of his joy. It was enough to see him all the way through. And so the way we tap into that joy is to know that as I face hardship and disappointment and suffering or rejection or loneliness or financial pressure or relational stresses, we face all that stuff, we can know that my life is in his hands, that he's walking with you through that valley. He'll never leave us, and that's the source of our joy if we're followers of Jesus. So the question becomes, how do we tap into that? Now let me go back to Hebrews and just broaden the two verses around it. As the author of Hebrews says this, let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinful men, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. The writer of Hebrews says, listen, fix your eyes on Jesus. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinful men, so that you don't grow weary and lose heart. In other words, the writer says you have to choose to fix your eyes. You have to choose to redirect your attention and your focus and your reflection off of the pain and the suffering and the challenge and the trial that you're facing. You have to lift your gaze and you have to consider Jesus. Fix your eyes on him. And I know some of you this morning are weary and you've lost heart. We could tease about all the things that maybe make people lose their joy, but the truth is it's a reality. Right? And some of you are facing some really dark and very hard things. And you probably, if you were honest, you would say, you know what? The writer of Hebrews says, I'm supposed to do this so I don't grow weary and lose heart. Well, I'm weary and I've lost heart. I'm discouraged. I'm disillusioned. I'm struggling and I don't have any joy at all. So I think the invitation this morning, what the writer of Hebrews would call us to and what Jesus was inviting his disciples to do is just to say, I get it. I'm not asking you to ignore it. I'm not asking you to deny it. And I'm not trying to minimize your pain and what you're going through. I'm just asking you to tap into me, to connect with me, to come to me, and I can give you a joy that will run deeper, that will sustain you even through the hardest things. That's what he offers us. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you this morning for the promise of your joy. Thank you that in a joy-starved world, you sent your son Jesus to become the one who would fight for our joy. And his battle would take him all the way to the bottom. He would go to the lowest place of humility and sacrifice. He would go to the ultimate demonstration of love for us, which is when he died on the cross. He did it because he was fueled by a joy, an undertow of joy that nobody else could see, but it was his source. It was his fuel for love. And he promised that we would have joy. We just confess that we let things and people and circumstances steal our joy. But we want to be people who live with that undertow of joy. So I ask that as we fix our eyes on you and we consider you, that this morning, especially for those who are struggling the most, who've lost heart, who are weary and tired and exhausted, I pray, Lord, as we sing this last song, that they would experience an infusion of your joy that could sustain them. So that you would do this in his name. Amen.